All right. Come join us at the front. Give your name, and we'll start the timer. So you're furthest right. You're wanting to talk with Jonathan? Yeah, sure. All right, come on up.
I didn't realize I was sitting in the number one seat.
Yeah, furthest right there. We're going to work from there left. You have a microphone there.
Oh, all right. Oh, Christopher. That's great to meet you. I knew the first one, too. It's good to meet you in person. It's good to meet you, too. Yeah. Is this on? Yes. Yes, it is. Very good. Well, it's good to meet you, Jonathan. Yeah. My goodness. I've been looking forward to meeting you for a while, and I missed your talk this morning. I'm very sorry. That's what late flight does. So go ahead.
So this is the time you can ask a question or give him a thought.
Well, let me just start by saying, I think you do something very singular, which is that you take something that is by its very nature ineffable, and you somehow make it intelligible to a lot of people. And I think by now you probably have a good sense of just how rare that is. And it's quite extraordinary. So, thank you for that. Truly, that's something. I think one of the things I think it's very hard to communicate without experiencing firsthand is that symbols are ways of seeing and ways of knowing, not things to know and things to see. You were just talking about that, the four of you up here. And that being inaugurated into the symbolic world has something to do with being induced into a relationship. It's not something that you can infer your way into. But that's very difficult, because then it leaves open the question for a lot of people who have never been inaugurated into it knowingly, but have lived it out, maybe unconsciously or unknowingly, like looking for something in the dark that's right beside you, having only to turn the light on, you know. So if seeing the world and knowing the world symbolically is not something that you can rationalize, but you have to be related to it, then I think the question for a lot of people, the thing that dogs people, the rub is how do you find your way into that relationship, right? How do you wake up in that world and find yourself in a relationship to it? How does that happen? Because it doesn't happen by ratiocination, right? Clearly, it doesn't happen just by dialogue. It happens by being struck by something relational. And if you had to explain it, as you have, to someone who's looking for it and doesn't know where to look for it, what would you tell them? Where to begin?
Well, I could say, let me maybe, I can explain how I brought my own kids into this kind of perception. And so what I would do with my kids is, before they were even capable of understanding what we were saying, is I would just tell them a lot of stories. Just fill them up with stories, Fairy tales from the Bible, traditional stories are much better, of course, but even stories, like even modern stories, are okay. And what I would do is I would just ask them, let's say if we're reading Snow White, and I would just ask them something like, if you notice that there's some parts of the story that look like other stories, and I'd ask them, what other story does Snow White look like? And they'd be like, oh, Sleeping Beauty, right, has that princess that falls asleep. And then, trying to help them see analogies, just that, right at the outset for kids, help them just notice analogies. And my experience, at least with my kids, is that at some point they started seeing them before I pointed them out. And they not only did they see them, but they also experienced the excitement, like a kind of aha, right, that aha moment. And so that's the way that I did it with my kids, and then the way that I tried to do it with people on YouTube and grown-ups is almost like using a kind of Zen koan strategy, which is to try to think, for example, of things that, like, what are things that people don't think have meaning, or what are things that some people think that cannot be related, and then shock you into seeing the relationship. Right? And so that's why you said you can't reason yourself into it. You almost have to get like a existential shock. And then when people, I can see it on YouTube, I can't see it, but if I'm talking to people, I can look at people in the eye and I can see that light, right? You see that light go on. It's like, oh yeah, they got it. Like they saw that connection. At least that's the way that I've been, so that's why it can actually help people understand why I talk the way I do, or I talk about the things I do, which is like I'll move from the most banal thing that you can think of, like putting on your socks, and then I'll say, well, that's like when Jesus went into Hades. It's like, really? Like, are you crazy? And then it's like, no, I'll help you see it. I'll give you a few examples to help you like smash that together. So I think that's probably, at least that's the only way I know how to do it. Yeah.
All right.
Beautiful. We'll leave it there.
Thanks, Christopher. And
Thanks,
we'll talk
Jonathan.
soon.
Yeah. We'll talk soon.
All right. Next person up. And we'll have 6 minutes for each one. 5 minutes, I'll just flash my phone to you.
Okay.
So you guys have a sense.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Wonderful to meet you.
Okay.
Hopefully we can build something together real quick in 6 minutes here. So I've been enthralled by your discussions about higher beings and the ontology of higher beings. We're talking about like egregores and demons and all this kind of stuff, and the analogies with cities and sports teams and all this kind of thing. And I'm curious, John, just offhandedly, I think during the discussion, had mentioned Evan Thompson's mind-life continuity thesis. And I was very grateful to have studied under Evan a number of years ago. And he was one of the popularizers of the idea of autopoiesis. Are you familiar with that term and the idea?
I mean, I understand it in the way that John explains it, so I don't know.
Yeah, okay, good. So essentially, just for everybody else real quick, it's essentially a pattern that two Chilean biologists suggest represent life, rather than all of the other, accidental properties of life, like reproduction and this kind of stuff, right? And the pattern's basically a network of processes that each buttress all the other processes in the network, while also creating a boundary in which those processes can sort of safely evolve.
Preserved,
Yeah. And so the kind of aha moment there is that this is a pattern, not a material.
Right.
And, I've heard John say real patterns a number of times too, and Daniel Dennett, a famous philosopher, wrote a paper, Real Patterns, where he talks about a real pattern being sort of an information preserving function. And so I'm wondering if you've ever considered using autopoiesis and then sort of the genus of autopoiesis is an autonomous system. And the difference there is just autopoiesis typically is related to the paradigmatic example of a single cell, but the organization is similar to an autonomous system. And if you've considered that sort of organization as a way of characterizing the higher beings.
Yeah, no, it's funny that you mentioned that, because it is something that I've been thinking about just privately for a while, and trying to formulate a defense, let's say, and this, I use the city in my mind, I'm using the city as an example, to use an example to describe a city as autopoietic, because especially if you understand like an ancient city with a wall, and then you have the guards on the wall, and you have the center of interest in the middle that gives the identity, and so and then you need a certain permeability, right, in that border in order for there to be potential that comes in, and that would probably be a good way to help people understand why it is that I talk about these higher beings as having something, at least analogical relationship to the way we understand biological beings, and that but it's a strict analogy, right? It's not just like some metaphor or whatever, that there's an actual structural analogy. But you're right, but I've never said that, like that's the first time that I'm saying that, but it is something that it's like one of those future videos that I'm planning, like at some point I want to try to use that example, so you have a good insight on.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I see we're at 3 minutes and 19 seconds.
Go for it. You
I
can
might
do
be
it.
able to extend this a little further.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I've sort of only recently kind of begun to understand is that through that process of sort of self-generation or self-creation, it seems like the system is modifying the universe in some way, right? Like it's, Evan says it's thermodynamically open, like you're saying you've got permeable membranes where energy flows through, but it's organizationally closed. Every piece of the organization influences another piece of the organization. And it struck me, Evan's mind-life continuity thesis suggests that the beginnings of consciousness and the beginnings of cognition happen at this organizational level. And that goes back to Francesco Varela, who was one of the originators of the term. And it made me think, because I know there's been a lot of discussion going on about whether these higher beings are conscious.
Yeah,
right?
I think they are. I avoid it because I don't think at this point it's necessary to get to that. Like, it's like, if you don't think it's conscious, that's fine. We can talk around it for now. We'll get to there later. But I do think that. And I think that that definition of consciousness in terms of autopoiesis, I think it's a very, to me, it's very attractive.
Yeah,
to understand that all things that act towards their self-preservation are conscious to a certain level, at least at that, just
at least some
level.
basic
Yeah.
primordial level. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I mean, I guess we're a little bit ahead of time, but that's
Good
what
stuff.
I wanted to
This
ask
is
you.
great, but you're seeing into the future of the things I'm going to be talking about. Like, I will talk about this in the next few years. But if you're interested, you can look at, I did a recent video on the left and right hand symbolism. And I talk
Yes.
about the relationship between gathering in and ejecting, or the relationship from a concentric relationship and eccentric relationships. And I think that in terms of autopoiesis, it's probably a very good way to understand the problem of this self-organizing or whatever, this organized structure that necessarily must be in relationship with others. And so it has to have these two currents. And these two currents are, I mean, they're super old. You find them in the Bible, but you also find them, that's what the alchemists, they were talking about this, right? And I know for a fact that when the alchemists talked about these two currents of concentric and eccentric movement, they were talking about them as structural and not as just can I say this, as just a kind of physical representation, like some kind of chemistry thing. But it really was they were talking about a structural pattern in reality that is as true for objects as for a person or anything that we can recognize as being, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. All right.
Hey. So I just wanted to quick talk about John Vervaeke characterized the imaginal space as an enhancement to what we do. And I kind of think that that's a little bit off, especially in relation to his goal of reviving the Neoplatonic tradition, because I don't think that the Neoplatonic tradition can exist on its own in a non-narrative way, let's say. Especially you can see this in the Middle Ages, because the great medieval synthesis was a synthesis between something like the Neoplatonic tradition and the Christian story. So I don't know if you wanted to say something about that.
No, I agree. I've said this before. It's like, for all the Greeks, all that Plato or the Stoics gave us, they only landed in the church. They didn't really have practice, and they didn't have body. They were mostly just thinking, and then the church was able to integrate them to the best way that's possible. But in terms of the imaginal, though, I think that the notion of the imaginal is something which is sadly lacking in a lot of Christian thinking, and I think it's there. The problem is that it's not there theoretically. It's there liturgically and iconographically, and so the structure, the architectural structure of the traditional church, its liturgies, its processions, the images on the walls, the stained glass, all of this is an intermediary space. That's what the imaginal space is. So you have this idea that you have something like completely spiritual principles or spiritual patterns, and then you have a space of instantiation but then there's a formation that happens in between, and that's where the imaginal space is. Now, the difficulty that we have as Christians, and especially as Orthodox Christians, and I've been fighting with a bunch of people about this. You don't see it as a fight because I'm so nice, but it's like discussing about this with a lot of people, is that in the Christian tradition, in the Orthodox tradition, there is high suspicion on any imagination. So imagination is banished. If you read the Philokalia, they're like, banish all thought, all images, all imagination. And it's like you have to get rid of this intermediary world. And it's as if the only world that exists is the pure connection between heaven and earth. But I think that if we explore it through the liturgy and through the iconography and through the art and poetry of the church, then we can recapture some of that, because we need that now. We need that now because we need it more than ever because of the scientific cosmologies. If I say heaven, we need the imaginal, because without the imaginal, it's like, you mean this atmosphere, or you mean the where the satellites are going? Because no one. So we actually need that intermediary space to recover that in a way that's thriving. So that's one of the things that I'm hoping to do. But I'm always careful, because I know that it's suspicious, to be honest, in the Christian tradition.
Yeah, and then just like one little quick last
Yeah.
thing. I think it's also like important to say that when the Christian story is happening, let's say. It's really not a very kind of boring like vacation Bible school type version of it, where instead all these ancient cultures, they brought themselves into the story in a way that was like really wild and radical, and probably in a way that a lot of other people, let's say maybe like more conservative types within the church, would not have approved of. Like for example, there was the Germanic tribes would relate themselves to, I believe it was like Nephilim and things like that, and that's a little bit insane if you know the tradition of Nephilim, from the Bible. But we have Saint Christopher, and that was a way that it also knit everyone together, and so so.
Yeah, well, so the imaginal space, it actually connects to this notion of the imaginal space as well, because so one of the things that happened in the way that Christianity, let's say, seeped into all cultures, is that when Christianity would arrive at the gate of a culture and there would be a conversion, there would be a desire in the culture to connect ourselves. They would want to connect themselves to the biblical story, and they would do that in ways that to us as modern people they just don't seem, they're very weird, because they would say things like, oh, we're descendants from the fourth son of Noah, right, the one we don't know about, or we're descendants from this tribe of Israel, or our people come from this place, because they were trying to connect themselves back to the biblical story. Usually they would do it in two ways. They would try to connect themselves to the Bible, and they would try to connect themselves to Troy. And so they would have these two origins, one which is the origin of the West in terms of the Trojan War, and one which is the origin of Christianity in the biblical story. And so it's difficult for us, so without a kind of imaginal space where we're able to understand the reason for these stories and these legends and these connections, it just becomes nonsense. So at least to help us understand it, at least to help us understand why, when Brutus goes to England and finds the giant Gog-Magog as he's escaping Troy, and he kills Gog-Magog to establish the Isle as a livable place. It's like, okay, so either we can just discount that, throw it out, and just not even mention it at all, or we can understand it in a way that is fruitful to understanding the way in which we understand our narrative connection to the past. So that's a little hard, but I think that it's important, and the imaginal is part of that. Sorry.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello, hello. Hey, Jonathan.
Nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you. So my question would be around technology. I think it was in Scott's speech about the Abbey. He had spoken about something that I think a lot has come into people's consciousness a lot more recently, which is things such as the World Economic Forum, right? And me being somebody, when I grew up, I always watched sci-fi movies. I love them. Didn't really have a necessary reason why, but I just like technology. I like seeing where it's going. Seeing a lot of the things that I used to be interested in and that you would think are kind of like from more of a dystopian landscape, like digital currencies, like crypto is one thing, the metaverse, people, for example, like digital twinning, like a social media company will create a profile of you and then poke and kind of prod at that profile in order to figure out how they can poke and prod at you to change your behavior. Seeing a lot of these things starting to kind of come into fruition and also to come into people's consciousness. Like now, in the past, maybe people wouldn't know about these things or it was only small subset groups. Seeing that these things are coming more to the fore, the kind of question that I've been struggling with recently is, because I have a deep interest in these things, like I really have a deep interest in crypto, but then when I see the possible negative implications of it when it comes to digital currency and smart contracts and a lot of this automation, it scares me a little, right? So I don't want to be operating from, what were the terms? The heuristics of beauty and heuristics of suspicion. I don't want to always operate from that suspicious place, right? I want to be able to engage with these technologies in a productive manner, you know? I want to see the New Jerusalem come rather than the, I don't know what you would call it, the dystopian dictatorship. So I guess my question is, seeing these technologies coming on the horizon, how do you decide how you engage with them? Like, where do I draw my lines in the sand where I say, okay, this is a line I will not cross? And how do you engage with these technologies in a way that's positive rather than negative? That's like one side to the question. And then the other question would be, do you think that those negative outcomes are inevitable?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so the way that I see the world, the way that it works in terms of in the Bible, the way I see it is that there's a fall and a recovery, and so God, you can say something like God covers the fall. So there's a fall, and then God covers the fall, and what comes after the fall is surprisingly different than, it's not exactly the same as what was before. There's like a kind of covering, and I think that you see that in the fall of Adam and Eve, which become the garments of skin, right? Mm-hmm. And then the fall of Cain, which become the social garment as the city, mm-hmm. and then that leads to death, and it leads to the flood, you know, to the giants and to the mm-hmm. end, right? So then the world gets reset, and you have a moment on the Revelation of Sinai where God gives Moses the plan for the tabernacle. Mm-hmm. And he says that he even names the person who's going to do it. And he says, you know, Bezalel and Oholiab. And he says, and Bezalel means something like the darkness of God. And Bezalel is a great artificer. And the only place in the Bible where that word is used is to talk about Tubal Cain. Mm. So the only other place where it uses that word is the place where they're saying that Bezalel is an artificer. So you can see it's like this covering of Cain's fall that happens, and then it keeps growing until something like the heavenly Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. So that's the process. Now, a lot of thinkers, modern thinkers, Jacques Ellul and that type of person, mm-hmm. they're able to see this descendants of Cain in technology, in the city, in civilization, in techno-bureaucratic states, and they just see it as purely evil. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that that's the proper story that we see in Scripture, you know. It's like, I think the conversion of Rome was a real thing. Rome, the bad, evil city that destroyed Jerusalem, converted. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that you could say something in terms of inevitability. I think that the way to see it is that it's going to get worse in the short term and better in the long term. But it's definitely, there's no way around the fact that we're going to go towards a crisis. Mm-hmm. And that the crisis of the technical state and of the bureaucratic, powerful state is imaged, of course, in Revelation as the beast, the number of the beast, all these types of images, which are very good if you want to understand the problem of how the state works. So in terms of what you do, like how do you deal with this? Mm-hmm. Man, that's one that I can't answer. I can't answer because I'm struggling with it myself. Really, I find it very difficult because here I am, yeah. I'm on YouTube. So the thing about technology is that technology always increases power. That's what technology does. That's pretty much the only thing it does. And so that power that it increases is real. It's a real increase in power. So it's a real increase in for example, like I can talk to way more people, that the best Baptist preacher, 100 years ago could talk to. And I could do that sitting in front of a screen and a camera. So it's crazy. The crazy increase in power is insane. But it has the downside, which is the danger of being seduced by the technology itself, or being seduced by even by the power itself.
Yeah.
So I think it's like a moral question or an internal question that we all have to.
Yeah, it's like an art that you kind of dance with and renegotiate with.
And I don't think the answer is the same for everybody. I just really don't think that. I think some people, some people can get completely addicted by their phone in a ways that when they're not using their phone, they become anxious, and that's a real thing. And it's like then other people will have this machine and barely use it, and there's a whole scale in between. So I don't think the answer is the same, sadly, for everybody.
All right.
Makes perfect sense.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. All right. Put the next person up.
Hi.
Hey.
I had some thoughts about your conversation with Richard this morning, and I was wondering if I can get your thoughts on that.
Sure.
So Richard talked about is there a dogmatic belief required for some of that participation? And I think you answered with there's a diversity spectrum of people who are all in, all the way to the outskirts of people who are less so, which I think implies that some level of belief is necessary to unlock the potential of full participation. And then you posed a question to him about how might someone outside of that religious structure participate in those things. And we have the idea of Rotary groups, where they are devoted to some kind of service, but then he brought in this hedonistic aspect of self-pleasure. They do it for the self-pleasure. And I think you brought up an interesting point of, well, how does self-sacrifice relate to that? Because it seems that if you're driven by pleasure, self-pleasure, there will be a severe limitation to how far you will go self-sacrificially. And so I wanted to kind of ask about this. I come from a Christian perspective, and so I believe that there is a totality of depth to the Christ story that's not represented anywhere else, and the buy-in to that story is what actually allows the full amount of self-sacrifice to occur. And so as people kind of do this mass exodus out of the church, partly because of the problematic dogmatic aspects, my desire would be as a Christian, just come back, right? But on a realistic point of view, it's like I know some people will be so dissuaded by the dogmatic aspects, they won't come back, but they'll still want meaning and maybe a practical pursuit of virtue. And so my question to you is, what are your thoughts on how much someone can actually achieve a self-sacrificial life of love without being centered in that Christ story? And if so, how might they go about practically achieving that as much as they can?
So, I mean, I think that the way to understand that question is that, we're still in the Christian story. Like, there's no way around that. The atheists are all in the Christian story. I'm sorry. We're still bound by that. It's still happening. It's still playing itself out. And atheism, a lot of the secularism and the atheism is what is it that Tom Holland said? He said Voltaire is criticizing Christianity using Christianity. And most of the criticisms against Christianity are Christian criticisms against the faith. So it's like taking the morality of Christianity and then turning it against Christianity and Christians and criticizing it. So we can't totally avoid it. So in a way, we're still surfing. We're surfing the end of Christendom. And so because of that, a lot of the values that Christianity holds are still really possible. Right? They really are, and people will live that way. And without having any faith at all in God or whatever, they can live that way. But that wave, like that surf, has a limit. There's a limit. At some point, you reach a point where that story starts to break apart. Now, I think that, especially with the Christian story is set up in a way that doesn't have how can I say this? It leads to something like Antichrist. That seems to be the way that it's presented, which is that it leads to its opposite ultimately, but that plays a mysterious role in bringing it back. So you come to the end of the Christian story, And then you come to a place where the only thing left. René Girard talked about that. He said after the revelation of self-sacrifice as the foundation of reality, you can only either be a Christian or Antichrist. There's no other way to play it out, because, and you can see it, like the Antichrist moment that we're living through, this idea of like the praise of the victim. That's a Christian trope. There's no other culture that has something like that. It's actually a Christian trope, and the idea that, but then it's a weaponized Christian trope. It's like, I see it in the story of Judas especially. Judas Judas shows us what this Antichrist moment that we're living looks like. He goes to Jesus, and the woman comes to worship him and wash his feet. And Judas says, oh, you should have sold that perfume and given it to the poor. Okay? And so the question is, does Jesus say we should help the poor? We heard it this morning, right? It was like pretty extreme. It's pretty intense, right? And so here's this woman coming to like sacrifice this perfume in order to wash the feet of Christ. And then Christ's answer is, like, this is the higher part, right? She's the one who's right. You're wrong. And Judas, it says that Judas, the reason why he was doing it was because he didn't really care about the poor. He was doing it to steal the money from the purse. So if you want to understand, let's say, like the Antichrist moment, you can see it. It's like weaponized compassion, which if you look a little carefully, you'll see that the person weaponizing it is doing it to accumulate power for themselves. You saw a little bit of that during the COVID time, where it's like, we're doing all these things out of compassion, and it's funny that the state just keeps growing its power as they're saying, be compassionate, and it's like this weird imposed compassion on you. It's like so I think that we're going to see more of that. It's gonna happen more and more, but to answer your question in general, I think that there still is a possibility for secular people to live the moral Christian vision, but it's kind of like, they're surfing the end of the wave. They're doing it still within the Christian story.
All right. Thank you.
Very good.
All right. All right, next person.
Hi. Thank you very much for coming out. This has been great. I think my first question was stolen by Matt, and then my backup was stolen by Mike. So this might be quick, so I've been reading The Language of Creation.
Okay.
And there's a lot of talk about the ancient worldview, right? And it's blown me apart, kind of, because the symbolism really opens up once you get to about page 100, But I'm having trouble because there's not many citations and there's no real place to source a lot of this. So when I dialogue with people, I get met with a lot of questions about that.
Yeah.
And I don't really know how to proceed. So can you maybe give me some advice on how to move forward in some of these conversations?
Yeah. So I'm not going to make excuses for my brother. I love him.
Fair.
I'm not going to make excuse for him. I think, like, Mathieu, there's an aspect of Mathieu, of my brother, who really doesn't care. Like, he really doesn't care what the standards are, what people expect of him. This is a real authentic, And so that's one of the things you're dealing with, is that you're dealing with someone who, sorry everybody, who hates the university very much and thinks the university is a corrupt, falling apart institution that has nothing left to give to the world. And therefore, because of that, he refuses to give them what they want. And so he wrote a book which is written like a medieval grimoire, right? That's written like a mathematical formula almost. And he's like, if you want to read it, read it. I think you'll get something from it, but I'm not going to make any excuses, and I'm not going to I'm not going to play for the people that I think are ruining civilization. So that's, I think he would agree with me, saying that. He's an intense, very, very intense person. But in terms of hints, like, I think that I think though that there are definitely sources. And so you can, I mentioned them, for example, within Christianity, you will find that St. Maximus, St. Gregory of Nyssa, you will find it in St. Ephrem the Syrian, the Hymns of Paradise. The structure of the Hymns of Paradise is exactly the structure of my brother's book. It's just this cosmic structure, but it's described in a poetic fashion. So if you're looking for someone who described the structure mathematically the way he did, in some ways you might not be able to find it, because there's also one of the problems of symbolism that I mentioned before, is that one of the reasons why we have to explain symbolism is not a great thing. Like, explaining symbolism is actually something like covering the fall, right? So it's not the best, because the reason why I have to explain it is because people don't live in it anymore, right? And so the ancients, it was just the water in which they were in. So because of that, you wouldn't find someone explaining the analogies that the church fathers used. They just used them, right? And they would say, here's this story in the Old Testament, and and it points to Christ in this way. And they would be like, yeah, that's all they needed to do. But they didn't have to say, well, there's this hierarchy of beings, and there's this structure, and all this stuff that we now have to explain, because for them, this is just the world they live in. But there are sources. You can find them in some of the texts that I mentioned. You will also find it in most texts that have a kind of mystical approach to reality will have something like that in them. You can read, there's a text called the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, which, and different universal histories, for example, the Legends of Alexander. There's all these later iterations that try to help you understand the structure and kind of how it lays itself up, but they won't explain it. They'll just show it to you, and that's why it's harder. But in terms of modern authors, I have mentioned with trepidation a few times. There was a symbolist at the beginning of the century. His name is René Guénon, who had one of the most insightful symbolist minds that I've ever encountered. And his writings can be extremely insightful, but they're also weird and dangerous and strange. Like, he also had strange affiliations, and he became a Muslim, and he was a Freemason, and he was all these weird things. And so you have to really be careful when you read someone like that, because you have to parse out, what is good and what isn't. And you can, and a lot of rabbinical traditions also have similar structures. If you read Ibn al-Arabi, for example, in the Islamic world, he talks about that kind of stuff. There's a text, Ibn Arabi wrote a text which is almost the same as Dante's Travel. And some people, it's so close that some people think that Dante copied Arabi. Yeah, but it's just this universal structure which just appears. And so, a few sources, but there could be more. Sorry.
All right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. All right. And our last person, and we'll transition groups.
Well, first things first, thank you very much, Jonathan. This has been really cool. I had no idea what to expect. I have to confess, I'm not familiar with your videos or the movement, but it's been really cool, and it's special to be here. So I study political theology. I'm a PhD student at University of Toronto, and as I'm listening to what you've been sharing, it's been really cool to hear, because I'm fairly convinced that the way that you are going about these things is the way forward, from a theological perspective, and just from I'm all about building bridges. I think building bridges and making connections and integration is so important. So it's been really exciting to be here. I think one of the questions that comes to mind for me is, so I'm studying political theology, and right now I've been reading a lot of critical theory, a lot of social theory, and integrating it theologically and into my project. And one of the questions that comes to mind as I've been listening to you, one of the things that seems to be happening is that there seems to be a description of, these broad societal trends, or what I now am wondering if I should call higher beings, or like these intelligences that you discussed. And so I'm wondering about, what you think of the relationship between what critical theory would describe, some of the things that critical theory would describe. If you want to talk about like colonialism, for example, it's very relevant up here in Canada, especially post-TRC. We're talking a lot about colonialism. How do you think that would reflect? How would you integrate that with what you're talking about in terms of higher beings and stuff like that?
Well, one of the things we're going to see happen, and we're already kind of seeing it happen, is we're going to see something like a fight of the gods, right? So it's not this is obviously an analogy to help you understand, is that as the central kind of common worldview starts to fray, we're going to start to see a fight over what to worship. And the fight over what to worship is going to manifest itself in a fight of theories of what is more true, what is more real. And so for example, the example colonialism is a really good one, which is that, let's say, what is the origin of Canada, right? What makes Canada Canada? And so some people will point to certain things, right? The founding, the exploration, this and that. And then others will say, well, no, it's violence, it's colonialism. And the difficulty is that becomes even more and more true at the end, you could say, of a story. Because all stories have sin in them, sadly. Like no story is bereft of sin. Like no nation, no person, everybody has sinned. And so how do we deal with that in the story? So you found something, and usually in the founding is a hidden sin. It's like a secret sin that you don't talk about right away. And then that sin is dealt with in different ways. It's kind of hidden, or it's kind of shoved aside, and we have our narrative. And as the narrative starts to weaken, it's normal that then the sins start to appear and start to reveal fruits that we hadn't talked about right now. And so the whole question, let's say, of how Canadians dealt with the native population and the notion of colonialism in terms of colonialism of the global South in general, that is exactly something like that, where the glorious story of expansion and all these things has a secret sin in it, which is colonialism. Now, the danger is to worship that God completely too, because if we just, let's say, how can I say this? If we just focus on the sin and we want to destroy the being because of its sin, it's not gonna play out well, because everything has sin. Like all of the stories have that in them. And so that is the way that I try to deal with that myself, is I believe that there's a way to balance our attention and to just balance it in the right way. Mm-hmm. That is, in the ancient world, they had these stories. Like, for example, they call them the nine worthies, right, in the late Middle Ages, and they would have these important characters in history. So they would have these pagan characters. I think it was Alexander and I forget who they were. And then what they would say was they would give their virtue. This is why they're worthy. We would honor them. And then they would also say, well, here are their vices, and this is how we have to avoid being like them. And I think that's something that it's because of the way that critical theory works, and because it's a revolutionary structure, it tries to weaponize the sin against the being, right? It's like, here's this evil thing you did, we're going to use it to destroy you. And I think that we have to really be careful about that. The best thing for us to do, the problem is that then the conservatives, they just react and they're like, no, 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 no. It's like, no, no, yes, yes, you did that, we did that, we did these horrible things. We have to be able to integrate them properly, to give the due to the horrible things we did, but without forgetting also the good aspects of the story. So in terms of political theory, I think that to me seems to be the way to go into the future, and to realize also that we all have those sins, and it's a fractal thing. So the idea, like, you can see it now. It's so interesting, 'cause, I lived in Africa for 7 years, and if you live in Africa for 7 years, you realize that the whole idea that racism is a specific thing that exists in America or in Europe is completely ridiculous. It's like there's a tendency in humans to demonize another and to enslave them or to reject them or to do whatever, and it happens at every level, in every culture, and so I think that's the danger of thinking that it's only one, that Canada is the only country that has ever done horrible things. Like, no. But we should own up for the horrible things we've done. But I don't know, like, I haven't thought about it in terms of principalities per se, but in a way, it is a kind of a fight over, at least a fight over narrative, and you could see it as a kind of struggle of the gods, maybe. Yeah.
Thank you for that. That was helpful.
All right, thank you.